Okay, so a quick mention of Dr. Colin A. Ross having a new interview on YouTube that I listened to last night, and he talks about his patent for um, an eye energy external energy detection system. So he realized that the if the brain emits electromagnetic energy that's then picked up as the EEG reading, that the eyeballs also must emit brain waves. And so then he created an experiment where he basically trapped the energy coming out of the eyes and measured it and proved that it was exactly the same as the brain waves, the only stronger, just as he had hypothesized. And he's pointing out that, in ancient cultures, there's this idea that you can of the evil eye and the awareness that you're being stared at. And um he said that because he proved that the energy coming out of the eyes is the same as the brain waves, that you can then utilize this to read your somebody's energy at a distance and therefore prove that somebody else is affected by that energy. And so he got a patent based on this concept where he designed some kind of system to detect the eye energy at a distance. And so for me, this is what I do. This is what I do every day, is that I um, build up energy. This is just actually just psychic, or what's called yin qi in Taoism, but it's the negative ions, and it's part of this quantum ether. and they, but Colin Ross, he points out that, well, when the brain waves are at a lower frequency, then they're able to travel long distance without being attenuated as the elf waves, and that's exactly what Andrei Puharich was focused on. And um, and then Colin Ross says, well, the Soviets were actually more advanced in figuring this stuff out than the West was, and doing experiments on dreams and changing people's dreams and stuff like that. But Colin was being interviewed about his book on CIA doctors, and I never read that book, but he also wrote another book on the human energy field, and that's where he talks about this concept. And I found that book on archive.org, so I read that real quick, just kind of speed read it, because it came out like 20 years ago, and I already knew a lot the information in it pretty much. So, but yeah, he talks about chi energy is just this bioelectromagnetic energy that he then says, you can measure it in microvolts. But he didn't mention Andrei Puharich. He did mention, of course, Ewan Cameron and William Sargent, and saying how they were both part of MK Ultra. And of course, William Sargent, he studied non-Western shamanism around the world. And another interesting thing, Colin Wilson argued that hypnosis is actually based on the freeze response by reptilians. So when a person gets hypnotized, they're actually in that freeze state. And I had never heard that before, but I always kind of suspected that's what hypnosis was. I actually have books on hypnosis that I haven't really. I've kind of looked at them, but I haven't read them page for page because it's like they still don't really know what hypnosis is, but if what Colin Ross says is correct, and it sounds like it is, then hypnosis is the same thing as being a psychic vampire because that's what psychic vampires do is they activate the low frequency um energy center or chakra in somebody's body, and then they and that fear reaction is the right side vagus nerve. So it's also what causes bliss in for like the female bliss reaction is that same right side vagus nerve, and it also activates the intestines. If you clear out when you clear out your intestines, that's it's the same right side vagus nerve, but it is activated as what they call parasympathetic rebound. So if you have like extreme stress and you get really, really afraid, then all of a sudden you'll go into this deep relaxation where you cannot move. And this is why like victims of rape will be blamed because they go into this freeze. You go into a freeze response, and you can't move, and that's also what causes PTSD is post traumatic stress disorders. This because it can it will that kind of trauma then will go into denial by the brain. The brain will try to cover it up, and he's been researching multiple personality disorder, which is now called dissociative identity disorder, and it's related to borderline personality disorder, which is also related to PTSD. And he's saying that psychologists and psychiatrists are in denial that this is caused by trauma instead of it being some kind of innate, like genetic thing or whatever. And he's saying the reason they're in denial is because they're in denial about the trauma they've caused to other people, just being in a patriarchal culture, whether it was like their graduate students or just family members or whatever, which I thought was pretty fascinating. And and this is what I talk about this in my 2012 books, what non-Western cultures call ghost pollution. So the in Taoism, the Po soul is attached to the yang qi, and that's actually the lower body energy. And so if somebody doesn't practice meditation, then when they leave their body permanently, they become a pole soul, which is then like attached to earth because um it's attached to your physical body at your grave. And so then like Qigong Master Chun Yulin, he says to um don't have sex or nearby cemeteries because if you conceive a baby, the pole souls around the cemetery are then attracted to that moment of conception, and it's what the French call the little death because that moment of conception is also that right side vagus nerve reaction. So there's a quantum level to that energy, the bliss that's experienced that then attracts the pole soul frequency, which is then wandering around outside the body as coherent biophotons. And so in Taoism, they talk about ghost pollution. So Qigong Master Chen Yulin, he said how he has to heal the ghosts that are around in a room, and it might take him several visits to heal those ghosts. And I even saw this happen when I was had my enlightenment experience. I saw the ghosts wandering in as human shaped lights, They were yellow lights shaped like humans, and they were floating around. They floated into the room, and then they hovered around Qigong Master Chen Yulin when he was in full lotus meditation. And at the time I saw it, I hadn't, he had never mentioned any of this before, and I didn't say anything about it. But then he said, since somebody can see this, I will explain what's happening. And, um, I mean, I could definitely already see it happening. So that's why, um, and I had read about it recently in the book, Fra Chun Moon. I'd read about that happening for he's the most famous Buddhist master, meditation master of Thailand. And he talks about also how ghosts would come to him to get healed. And so by healing, what happens, as Trini Lin explained, is the light gets really bright. And Ramana Maharshi explains this also, where when you go into Nirvikalpa Samadhi as enlightenment, or what they call nirvana, which is, like the emptiness, the void, the absolute void always radiates light, but the light is so bright that it's the same as deep sleep. So when we go into deep dreamless sleep at night, we have no sense of ourself and no sense of space time or existence or anything. But Ramana Maharshi, he points out, well, are you just a machine that turns on in the morning when you wake up? Or is there a level of consciousness that is still you that exists, even though your thinking mind is not aware of it at all? And if that's true, then that's must be your true self, who you really are. And when you do meditate a lot, what happens? The main disciple of Ramana Maharshi is Punjaji, or Papaji, and HWL Punja. And points out that the very first thought you have when you wake up is this same it's the same experience as samadhi, because it depends on what cycle of sleep you are when you wake up, but you can be self-aware of your dream state in that very first breath and thought when you wake up. And so you'll be in the REM brain waves, which is the REM dream state. It's the theta brain waves, or alpha brain waves. And when you achieve that state, then you can, like they've studied rats and mice, they stay in that theta brainwave state, and that's why they have really good sense of smell. Because when humans have a new smell that they perceive, their brain suddenly goes into that theta um, brainwave state. And in Taoism, the sense of smell is tied to the Po soul as the yang qi. So the sense of smell is tied to the lung energy, which is closely tied to the right side vagus nerve, because the right side vagus nerve controls your lungs, and it also controls your heart. And so then they talk about in Taoism that the right side of the heart has this. It also has a like the it's the yang qi, the tiger channel, goes to the right side of the heart, but that's due to this right side vagus nerve connection that then goes to the lower body after that. So, um, again, I had this experience where I felt a very strong shock and on the right side of my heart, and it shocked me into silence. And Qigong Master Jim Nance was sitting next to me, and he just said, after I was shocked into silence, he just said, "Well, I wanted to see if you were speaking from your heart." And you were. And before he said that, he had been totally silent, so um he he shocked me into the truth of reality right there. Because that right side of the heart is what Ramana Maharshi calls the pinhole, to the formless awareness of the universe, or what science calls proto consciousness. So it's like Deepak Chopra was just in the Epstein files, and he was already outed in Guru Philiac as, somebody who goes to prostitutes on the street and stuff like that. And it's like, so the fact that he was in the Epstein files did not surprise me. But of course, people were quick to make fun of quantum consciousness as it must obviously be fake because look, Chopra, he's totally fake, and his whole career has been about quantum consciousness. Therefore, you know, like Professor Jean Brimond, um, he's totally against any kind of paranormal understanding of quantum physics. But just because he is doesn't mean that other physicists are not. So, like if you read this book, they talk about Dean Rickles is a quantum physicist, and he's they're talking about Jungian psychology and how there definitely is a quantum consciousness, according to what they call proto consciousness, and it's defined by non-commutativity. And so Professor Basil J. Haley was very honored to have a chapter in this book about his research. As that's what he told me, in our correspondence. And I started reading this book, Endless Holocaust, Mass Death in the History of the United States Empire. Um, David Michael Smith. Whoops. Yeah. So, with the recent murders in Minneapolis that were filmed by the Border Patrol thugs, just like ice cold murder by ice in Minneapolis, where there's lots of ice and the ice agents are slipping on the ice. But it's it's it proves that this is what so-called Western civilization is founded on. This book goes into the details as a structural. I mean, nothing has changed. In terms of the psychology of civilization. Here's another one. I haven't I haven't read this book yet. Two wars, and Hitler. Who was responsible? So, basically, like when we think of the what they call ghost pollution in non-Western culture, um, it's basically means that the post soul is in control of the. It's like a mass hypnosis of humans to be alive. So the left brain dominance means that the right brain subconscious is actually in control. And um and this is how modern civilized consciousness is defined, through mathematics. And this is what my 2012 book goes into. And I mean, this has been developing since the invention of writing and agriculture, farming worldwide. The plow-based technology for it's really becomes patriarchy, and so it's kind of like a chimpanzee culture. And the I mean, humans are way better than chimpanzees at this culture. So that's the point of Professor R. Brian Ferguson in his book, War, Chimpanzees, and History, is that even when we think that chimpanzees practice war, that's really their like an extreme context where they're feeling all this pressure from human so-called civilization. And um so what is my point here? Oh yeah, there was a study recently on this ecologically unequal trade. And this is of course what I studied for my undergraduate degree, where I had a degree with a third in natural science and a third in economics and a third in political science. And it was supposed to be sustainability and to integrate those three areas. And what I discovered is they all lie about each other. And that's exactly what this ecological unequal trade study is all about. Let me put the link in the chat. So, yeah, so essentially, if you define economics honestly and take into account the ecological value of resources, which of course includes fertile soil, clean air, clean water, um, and things like free time, quality of life. Like a person might be poor by Western standards, but this was the point of the documentary Ancient Futures by uh, Norberg Hodge. She studied Ladakh, which is like called Little Tibet before it was westernized. But the documentary is basically saying, well, you had this like Rambo culture come in a matter of like 10 or 20 years where it completely just like took over. And so I suppose that'd be in the 1980s because that's when Rambo was really big, right? I don't know. I never really watched any Rambo movies, but this is what Dr. Helen Caldicott calls missile envy, where you have this like what I call ejaculation addiction because like Dr. Gail Dines, that's her focus is on how porn when it became mass marketed through cable television in the 1980s, then it's targeted young males when they're growing up. And so before a male finishes puberty, then they get hardwired to have this low frequency intention in their soul. And the how I define the soul is what I call the magnetic moment of the virtual photons. And Andrija Puharich talks about this also. So Colin Ross, he mentioned how one of the victims of Ewan Cameron, after she got electroshock treatment like constantly, um, she could no longer remember her family, or she used to play guitar and sing and she couldn't play guitar anymore, and she had total amnesia of being put into the hospital and down to one of the times she was born. So her whole life was completely wiped out. But after she got out, she was able to slowly recover and heal herself and recover her memories. And so to me, that proves that there's this soul level of healing. So somebody's spirit as a personality can be destroyed, but their character is on the soul level. And I experienced this soul level healing from the Qigong masters. And one time I was getting healed by Qigong master Jim Nance, and he never touched me for any of the healings, but I could feel the energy. It felt like this high voltage, like electrical. buzzing, electrical buzzing sensation. It was moving around in the lower part of my body, and it's more specifically the reproductive area of my body. So it was unusual to say the least, but I trusted what he was doing, and as he was doing the healing, it's like I could tell it wasn't just energy, but it was information. He could see what he was clearing out. And then when he was done, he said, "How do you feel?" And I said, "I feel lighter." And he really appreciated that response because I felt physically lighter. And now, if we think of the magnetic moment of the virtual photon, then it's due to the relativistic mass of the photon. And so that term relativistic mass is no longer used in science, but essentially it has to do with the difference between kinetic and potential energy in terms of gravitational energy. I can't remember all the details, but I do know that the paper Light is Heavy by Gerard de Hooft, who is a Nobel Prize physicist, and Martin van der Mark. It's basically explains that because in relativity, the mass is also defined as energy momentum, but due to quantum physics, there's no center of mass for the frequency of the photon because the photon has no rest mass, and therefore it's constantly in motion. And because you don't have a center of mass, that's where you create this paradox that Louis de Broglie discovered that he called his law of phase harmony. And it's just the paradox between time and frequency. So, in terms of relativity, time is slowing down, but you measure time in relativity and classical physics as a wavelength and spatially. And so most physicists argue that, time doesn't exist, that it's an illusion of our biological perception, and that entropy is a statistical measurement that shows a direction of time, but the direction is just a spatial measurement, and ultimately you can just convert time to a spatial relativistic measurement. And that's why you can say the universe is expanding faster than the speed of light, because it's all due to the relativistic difference of density between matter. And so time doesn't exist unless you have matter that is measuring it. And since you can't measure anything at the speed of light through the photon, therefore the speed of light is the invariant speed limit of any kind of measurement. But in quantum biology, what we're saying is that you don't have to do any kind of external measurement, and that's the secret of meditation. You turn the light around, and you are the light by definition. But then you're using that light to listen to the source of the light, and it's that listening process that enables a negative frequency and a time reversed signal. And that's what the virtual photon is. The virtual photon is that negative frequency time reverse signal that um, is an eternal motion. But when you turn the light around, you're able to then resonate with that soul level, and it has a inherent charge to it as the magnetic moment. And the magnetic moment is um, it's actually the spin. So spin in quantum physics is neither a wave nor a particle. And so in non-commutativity, what they argue is that time is inherent to reality, and so is entanglement as non-locality. So you don't need to create entanglement as an experimental condition. But because of this phase harmony, there's a quantum coherence that can be maintained into the macro level of matter. And so all matter is actually made of light. Um, and this can be experienced then through meditation. And the book, The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot, tried to describe this reality as he, he had experienced poltergeist as a child. And then um, that's what led him to research the paranormal. And he wasn't correct in the end. He tried to equate Karl Pribram with David Bohm, but the problem is that Karl Pribram could not understand non-commutativity. So Karl Pribram was still stuck in the Fourier mathematics, which is just like complex mathematics. But yeah, so it seems it's like a real subtle logical difference that, of course, most people would never understand. I mean, since I'm not a scientist, I don't know like all the details memorized and all that. But essentially, a lot of most physicists they Carlo Rovelli. He's considered the expert on the definition of time in physics, and he says quantum biology is BS. You know, he just totally against it. But he worked with Alon Khan, and Alon Khan he actually he's featured in this book as talking about quantum biology and saying quantum biology is the real deal. So when it comes to quantum biology, it's very controversial. Like even in the science community, you know, like you have physicists that are totally against it, and biologists that are totally against it. So it's pretty fascinating. And um, so in terms of the ghost pollution and this problem of endless holocausts and um, Minneapolis being under siege, where anybody could have their door bashed in and a person could be disappeared into a detention concentration camp where they're denied access to an attorney. So they're getting their Bill of Rights violated. Habeas corpus is not directly Bill of Rights, but it's in the U.S. Constitution. And so people are really like when people figure out this is what's going on, then they're really shocked. But most people or people who watch like faux news, they think it's great because they're mind controlled to think, oh, we gotta these protesters are just causing problems and they're in getting in the way of people trying to do their job and blah blah blah. But what people don't realize is that the U.S. is an empire and the FBI was created from the military police in the Philippines, as Professor Alfred McCoy detailed. And so the what Minneapolis is experiencing is what like the native population here. They point out, well, this already happened to us in Minnesota. You know, when the Westerners colonized the land, the Whipple Detention Center. That's where my brother-in-law had his immigration trial that I was not supposed to attend or know about or anything because my dad didn't want me to have to testify. But let's see if I get more water. Anyway, let's see here. I'll drink some water from this. Alrighty. So this is like from New Mexico, I think, because my family used to drive down there every summer. And yeah, so yeah, people are shocked to realize, well, democracy actually is like a scam because the truth of so-called civilization is just like this. The periphery of the empire is based on these, like disappearing people and torturing them, and this patriarchal ejaculation addiction of rape and um, mass mass death, mass murder, and all that. And then, of course, we destroy life in general on Earth, through industrial so-called progress. And what's ironic about this is that, like, I was watching a some kind of legal philosophy YouTube channel, and he's talking to a professor, and they're talking about, I don't know, Kant and um, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and all this stuff about like what is negative freedom. Well, negative freedom, is the kind of the definition of sovereignty, supposedly. And so they're saying, well, if you want to just like live in your own private garden for the rest of your life, that would be negative freedom because you have the freedom to not engage with the rest of society. But it's actually not true because it's illegal to be poor. So if you live off the land, um, uh, John Locke argued that you can't have legal contracts with native indigenous people because they don't quote improve the land. And by improving the land they mean Platonic mathematics as irrational magnitudes, so the Pythagorean theorem, and defining time as a spatial symmetry in the geometry. And anybody who does any kind of construction, they're relying on, like, if you the oldest buildings are circular, so they use a circular, um, and they're temporary, they're shelters, and so we would call that camping. But then, the government cracks down on that and say, "Well, you can't camp on your land. You can't, live." So, I mean, that's the International Building Code, so that's Western educated, industrialized, rich democracies. Is there You have to inherently destroy ecology to be legal. It's illegal to be poor and live off the land, you know? So, um, so it's also illegal to, like, practice real meditation in nature. Because first of all, you need, like, the definition of religion in the West is to meet regularly in a structure, in a in a in a Platonic, um, structure, with the irrational magnitude. So you need a group of people that meet regularly in a structure, as defined by International Building Code. Cheers. So that's what I get into in my 2012 book. Like, that is the definition of the Matrix. The Matrix is from Platonic philosophy, and um, so it's not just like philosophy in terms of like thinking and concepts, but it's philosophy in terms of mathematics and the law and patent law. And empire. And so now they're saying, well, capitalism has exploited everything on earth and there's nowhere else to go. Well, that's true, except the religion of technology is what Jeff Bezos calls a planetary preserve. So Earth is now considered a preserve. It's not even it's like a zoo, right? And so it needs to be preserved so we can colonize outer space, and that's the like Earth is already a done deal. We're done exploiting Earth according to the super, the super elite centi billionaires, or and I mean, basically, like the more rich you are, the higher level of denial there has to be. And so then with the Epstein file, the latest release of Epstein files, they've proven that there is this network of what David Icke or whatever called the reptilians. And so how would you define the reptilians? I mean, it's relying on this freeze response in people. You're hypnotizing people with this freeze response. And that's exactly what Donald Trump does. Like when he attacked that female journalist the other day, he was trying to hypnotize her, by inducing this freeze response, which is like a psychological threat as hypnosis. And the problem is that it activates the life force energy, the sex center in people. And so a lot of people are attracted to that. They're like, "Oh, not only am I scared, but I'm also attracted." And what they don't realize is that the psychic vampire is then sucking off that energy, like literally feeding off it and then using it to ejaculate. That's what the psychic vampire does. And that's exactly why Epstein was, doing like victimizing multiple females a day. And he wanted what they called nubiles because, Jaylene Maxwell, she would literally run across the street to if she saw a nubile and try to convince the nubile with her high class British accent, to be a victim of Epstein. So they're literally feeding off the psychic energy of the young females so they can ejaculate, which is, um, and then of course the whole system being materialistic has this psychological denial. So the idea is that they think that they're in control when they're doing this because their left brain is saying, "Oh, I'm gonna do this. I'm planning. I'm gonna be a predator. I'm planning to capture this person's energy." Like literally, they know that they're sucking off this energy and ejaculating it out. And but the problem is that's their left brain thinking that, but it's actually an addiction that they can't control, and they're dependent on like a parasite. Um they're dependent on the external energy, whereas in real meditation it's an internal growth process. So what they call the Wan Chi in Taoism, which is also called the female green dragon, as I've explained, in detail. You have to You can only do it internally, and you can only do it through listening listening to the formless awareness. And that's why they say the Tao will never be spoken of, the Tao will never be seen. Um, so it's based on logical inference. And, again, in our culture, if you try to meditate, you have to do a space-time exorcism of the energy around you. In other words, a soul healing is a space-time exorcism. Um, and this is also why precognitive visions occur when you do deep meditation. And Dr. Christina Donnell has that book, Transcendent Dreaming, where she goes into her experiences with precognitive healing visions. So the visions are more real than being awake, and the visions actually can transform physical reality also. And she was there was a man interviewing her on that Buddhist at Buddha at the gas pump that why he got really mad at her because he said, "Well, if you have a precognitive vision of something bad that's going to happen, wouldn't you try to stop it?" And she said, "No." Now, why would she say that? Because the Wan Chi energy, that it's your true soul energy, what Roger Penrose calls this proto consciousness, um, is actually the always it's always in the future, and so it's your real self, but it's not your thinking self. And so in a sense, like, the dependency of humans is on, what I call the cosmic, well, what they called in ancient times the cosmic mother, and they worship the cosmic mother. They also called it the womb of the universe, and I call it the female formless awareness. And in Taoism, it's the female green dragon. Um, and so the Wan Qi, the Wan Jing, and the Wan Shen, or which is the Qi and the life force, which would be like electrochemical energy, and the um, Wan Shen, which is what they call the light of no light, or the clear light, but it's also called the yellow light, the yellow sprouts, and that's what the color of the ghosts were that I saw also. So that's sort of like the the soul energy is when you see the blue light, then you're tapping into that virtual photon energy, because the blue light, externally it's seen as gold, the golden aura. So you start to create physical transmutation at that level of meditation. And science even explains that the element gold relies on the blue light absorbing virtual photons from the future. And so the non-commutativity is not against science. In fact, we rely on science as our true religion of technology. But it's just pointing out that there's this deeper dynamic going on that already exists in nature as the truth of reality, and that Mother Earth is tied to the cosmic mother through this eternal motion of time, and that mainstream science based on the symmetric mathematics, commutative geometry, is then in psychological denial because of this left brain dominance and right hand technology. To test any kind of scientific experiment, you have to keep tweaking the technology used to make the measurements. The units being used, the mathematical units, have to become more precise, and then the technology has to be created to measure those units. And this is what Collins discusses. He's the philosopher of science, Harry M. Collins, and he has a book called, or he has an article on, I think it's called "Gold from Lead" or something like that, and just talking about how you constantly have this proof by contradiction in science is based on the proof by contradiction. So you don't ever actually prove anything, but you have successful experiments that can be replicated. But in non-commutativity, it can never actually be replicated. So in yoga philosophy, Yogananda calls this ever new, ever fresh. Because if you have eternal motion of time, then it's always going to be changing. You can never make an external measurement without needing time to make the measurement. So as long as you have time as an external parameter, you're always going to be limited by that the definition of time itself. And so it's only through logical meditation and listening that you're able to tap into this truth of reality. And that's why it was the core of our oldest human culture, the San Bushmen. Um, they focused on all the males doing this Tashoma training, where they'd go away for a month and do the dancing and singing and get the healing energy from the owner of Gum would the older males, and then train to be healers, and it would take them decades to master the energy because the the physiological transformation is intense, and then and at the very advanced level they go beyond physical death when they are doing the deep healing. And Qigong master Chen Yulin said he would not recommend this for anybody, to experience this, having the heart stop for over, well, he said for 2 hours. 2 hours he was walking around with no heartbeat. And so the Wan Chi energy is like a byproduct of your spirit accessing your soul. And the soul has the future already in it, which is hard to fathom. But when you realize like reality is actually like this fifth dimensional black hole, then it kind of like, and it, you can only access it through this listening process. So the problem is that when you start having a lot of precognitive visions coming true, then the Tibetan monks, they call this dream yoga. So you start to realize that being awake is actually a state of dreaming, and the truth of reality is something that cannot be seen, but it's creating physical reality in a more lucid and scintillating like source of all of our perceptions. So that's why the qigong masters, they can smell cancer. And this in our ancient I had this experience, and it smells like rotting flesh in another person. And our original human culture described this also. When they do healing, um, that's what they heal. They heal the rotting flesh, and they say that this is due to the spirits, the ghosts, like feeding off the energy of humans, and to cause that sickness. So um, you can see how, like, this guy, Qigong Master Robert Peng, he describes an experience where his master like took a physical attack and then was able to heal himself with no blood or anything. And then his master then said, "Go out and look at this tree." And he goes out there, and the tree had the same attack on the tree. I can't remember if it's in here, but um, yeah. So it's like really wild stuff that that it's also dangerous, right? So the like Qigong master Jiang Feng was somebody that somebody came to visit me, and they said they had gone to see Qigong Master Zhang in China, and they saw him doing pyrokinesis. And there was other people on the this forum I used to post on, the Dao Bums forum, and they were students of Zhang Feng. And but then Zhang Feng, he overused his energy once, and he just keeled over. He was healing somebody, and he just like did it too fast and used too much energy. And that Wan Chi energy, it comes from the heart, the right side of the heart. So he ran out of Wan Chi energy. And so that's what happens when you meditate deeply is you're accessing the soul energy. And so this is from essentially like your it splits into yang and yin chi energy as you once you hit puberty. It starts just like splitting and getting used up as yang and yin chi energy. And so when you are consciously able to access the wan chi energy, you're able to burn it up faster. And once you burn it up, you kind of like burn up your own soul energy, and then you become what they call a ghost immortal. And after that, you're dependent on either more meditation to increase your Wan Chi energy and store up more Wan Chi energy, or you can try to get it from food, and the food will turn into Yin Chi energy, and then you can build up more Yin Chi energy again through meditation. So this is what happened to me. This is where This is I'm stuck in the Yin Chi energy, and the only way I could get beyond that is if I just switch to meditating full time. Um, and that's all right. I mean, I had a lot of wild experiences. I still, I do the Yin Chi healing out of my brain. I can feel my eyes pulsating, and the Yin Chi it just flows on its own when it's where it's needed, unless you consciously store it up and stop that from happening. Okay,